Beneath the silent waves of the ocean lies a name that has haunted human imagination for millennia: Atlantis. Was it only a myth, a bedtime story wrapped in salt and shadow? Or could it be something more, an ancient memory carved into the collective mind of humanity? Today, we won't search for streets paved in gold or temples of crystal. Instead, we open a case file and look for the truth that may still lie buried beneath sand, stone, and sea. Our only witness in this investigation is a philosopher, not a priest, not a poet, and certainly not a fantasist. His name, Plato. To understand Atlantis, we must begin not with explorers or treasure hunters, but with one of the greatest thinkers the world has ever known. Plato lived in Athens more than 2,300 years ago. His works laid the foundation of Western philosophy, shaping how we think about justice, politics, and the very nature of reality. But among his many dialogues, to stand apart for a very unusual reason, in Timaeus and Critias, Plato described a lost civilization, a naval empire, advanced, ambitious, and doomed. Unlike myths told in temples or taverns, Plato's story was written in the language of history. He gave dates, names, measurements, and geography, the kind of details one might expect from an eyewitness account or at least a legal deposition. And so, the story begins, not as a fairy tale, but as a case file. Let's open it. The victim, a mighty naval empire, technologically advanced and powerful. The location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. The scene, an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, Plato says, featuring concentric circles of land and water, harbors and palaces, bridges and temples. The time of death, around 9,000 years before Solon, the Athenian lawmaker who passed down the story, which places the fall of Atlantis roughly 11,600 years ago. The cause of death, in a single day and night of misfortune. Earthquakes and floods swallowed Atlantis whole, dragging its glory beneath the waves. These are not the broad brushstrokes of a bedtime legend. These are clues, data points, testimony. Plato even gives us suspects and motives. Atlantis, he says, had grown arrogant, corrupt, defying the natural order. They raised armies, sought to conquer the Mediterranean, and clashed with the ancient Athenians. Their punishment, obliteration by the gods themselves. But here's the complication. Plato is our only witness. Number other Greek historian, not Herodotus, not Thucydides, not even Homer mentions Atlantis. For some, that's enough to dismiss the tale as pure invention. But others argue that Plato was passing down something older, a story inherited from Egyptian priests, relayed to Solon, and finally recorded in Athens. So, what do we make of this testimony? On one hand, we have a highly specific account, filled with measurements, timelines, and political drama. On the other hand, we have no corroborating evidence, no inscriptions, no ruins, no second source. And that is what makes the mystery so enduring. If Atlantis was a lie, it was the most detailed lie ever written. If it was the truth, it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. This is why our investigation begins here, with Plato. He may be a philosopher, but in this case, he acts as our star witness, and perhaps our unreliable narrator. Because like any good detective story, the first testimony rarely tells the whole truth. So, we now have a case file. The question is, where does it lead? Our first suspect is not hidden beneath waves or buried in myth, but carved into the very stone of the Mediterranean world, the Minoans. Around 4,000 years ago, on the islands of Crete and Thera known today as Santorini flourished one of the most dazzling civilizations of the Bronze Age. The Minoans ruled the seas of the Aegean with ships swift and strong. They traded with Egypt and the Levant, built palaces that seemed to breathe with color and light, and painted frescoes that still glow with life after millennia. To walk through their ruins today is to feel a strange echo of Atlantis. Advanced architecture, intricate drainage systems, even multi-story palaces like Knossos that whisper of a society centuries ahead of its time. Plato's description of a great naval empire, wealthy and powerful, does not seem far from the truth of the Minoans. But every great empire has its downfall. Sometime around 1600 BC, the island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted. Not just a volcanic eruption, but one of the most catastrophic natural events in human history. Imagine a column of ash reaching 20 miles into the sky, pyroclastic flows scorching everything in their path, waves taller than city walls tearing across the Aegean. In that single moment, the proud fleets of Crete, the bustling ports of the Minoans, could have been swallowed by fire and water. Plato wrote of Atlantis perishing in a single day and night of misfortune. The parallel is chilling. Computer models today estimate the eruption of Thera to be hundreds of times more powerful than Hiroshima. The island itself collapsed inward, forming the caldera we see today. A tsunami perhaps 100 meters high would have struck Crete within minutes. Entire coastal cities would vanish in a heartbeat. This was no gradual decline. It was a sudden execution, delivered by nature itself. And like any crime scene, the evidence remains. On the southern tip of Santorini lies Akrotiri, a city frozen in time, streets lined with three-story houses, storage jars still in their places, frescoes of blue monkeys and elegant ladies preserved in volcanic ash. It is often called the Pompeii of the Aegean, but in some ways it is even more haunting. For while Pompeii preserves the dead, Akrotiri preserves only the living world they left behind. The people themselves had vanished, perhaps fleeing before the final blast. Here we find proof of a brilliant society wiped from the map in a single catastrophe, just as Plato described. The parallels are strong: a naval empire dominating the seas, sudden destruction in a single day and night, a lost city buried under ash, its memory nearly erased. Could it be that Plato's Atlantis was not in the distant Atlantic Ocean, but right here in the heart of the Aegean Sea? Perhaps the legend was born from real events passed down through Egyptian priests, distorted across centuries, and finally retold by Plato as a moral fable. But the problem, yet, the case is not airtight. Plato places Atlantis at 9,000 years before Solon nearly 11,600 years ago. The Minoans lived only 3,600 years ago. He describes an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. The Minoans lived within the Mediterranean, far inside those gates. So how do we explain this? Did Plato intentionally alter the details, bending truth into allegory? Did he multiply years by 10, a simple mistranslation of Egyptian records? Or was he weaving together fragments of truth and myth into something larger than either? The Minoan hypothesis remains the most widely accepted theory among historians, not because it proves Atlantis existed, but because it shows how myth can crystallize around real, tragic events. The fall of the Minoans reminds us of a sobering truth: that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are always at the mercy of nature. And perhaps that was Plato's point all along. Our first suspect has motive, means, and evidence. but the timeline doesn't quite fit. So we must look further, beyond the Aegean, beyond accepted history, into stranger, wilder territory. Our next suspect lies not beneath the ocean, but in the heart of a desert, the Sahara. From space, it looks like an enormous eye staring back at us. The Richat structure of Mauritania, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, to the untrained eye, it may appear as just another geological oddity, but to some researchers and to millions of curious minds online, it is nothing short of astonishing. Because when you place Plato's description of Atlantis beside images of the Richat structure, the resemblance is hard to ignore. Plato spoke of an island with concentric rings of land and water, alternating circles perfectly measured. The Eye of the Sahara is nearly 23 kilometers across. Its rings are vast, precise, visible even from orbit. He wrote of mountains to the north. The Richat has exactly that, ridges rising up like guardians over the formation. He described a channel to the south that opened into the sea. Today, dry valleys run southward, evidence of ancient rivers that may once connected to the Atlantic. And most intriguing of all, the location. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. West Africa lies just beyond those very straits. Could it be that the Sahara, once fertile, once green, once alive with rivers and lakes, was home to the very city Plato described? The problem, of course, is obvious. Atlantis was said to sink beneath the waves. Yet here lies the eye, high and dry in the desert, thousands of kilometers from the sea. Geologists insist the Richat is a natural structure, a deeply eroded geological dome formed millions of years ago, not the handiwork of an ancient civilization. No ruins of stone walls or temples have been found here. No pottery, no inscriptions, no harbor remains. Nothing yet that speaks clearly of a great city. And yet, the questions remain. Could the Sahara have once been very different? But we now know that only 5,000 years ago, this desert was not a desert at all. It was a vast green land filled with rivers, lakes, and grasslands teeming with life. Ancient rock art in the region shows giraffes, elephants, even swimming people. Proof that water once ruled here. Could it be that in an even earlier age before desertification, this area was fertile enough to host a thriving civilization? Could rivers have filled the eye's concentric basins, matching Plato's description of rings of land and water? If so, perhaps the sea that swallowed Atlantis was not the Atlantic Ocean, but a flood of biblical proportions, a collapse of climate that turned paradise into desert. Still, hard evidence is scarce. Archaeologists have only just begun to explore the region, and while stone tools and signs of early settlement have been found in Mauritania, nothing on the scale of a city matching Plato's vision has yet emerged. The Richat structure remains an enigma, geological marvel, natural wonder, or the weathered bones of a forgotten civilization. It is, at the very least, a tantalizing coincidence, a fingerprint in the desert that echoes the words of Plato with uncanny accuracy. Perhaps it is only a trick of nature, or perhaps it is a clue that the story of Atlantis is more widespread, more deeply rooted in our planet's memory than we ever imagined. Either way, the Eye of the Sahara forces us to look closer, to question harder, and to expand the map of our investigation beyond familiar shores. Our second suspect may not be guilty beyond a doubt, but it leaves us with enough reasonable suspicion to keep the case alive. And so, the investigation must move further still, back through time to the very end of the Ice Age, when rising seas swallowed whole continents and myths were born in the shadows of catastrophe. To find our third suspect, we must look not to a single location, but to time itself. Plato dated the fall of Atlantis to 9,000 years before Solon, roughly 11,600 years ago, and that date is no coincidence. Because science now tells us that around 11,600 years ago, the Earth was in turmoil. The younger Dryas, the sudden, violent end of the last ice age. Glaciers melted, oceans surged, coastlines were redrawn across the globe. Entire ecosystems collapsed almost overnight, and with them, millions of square kilometers of habitable land vanished beneath the rising seas. We call these lands ghost continents. Doggerland in the North Sea, once home to hunters, villages, and forests, now lies drowned beneath the waves between Britain and Europe. Sundaland in Southeast Asia, an enormous landmass larger than India, was swallowed as sea levels rose, leaving behind only the islands of Indonesia, and perhaps most haunting of all, Beringia, the bridge that once connected Asia and the Americas, disappeared beneath the rising waters, erasing a highway of human migration. These were not myths. These were real places, real lands, real homes for our ancestors, all gone within the span of human memory. So, what if Atlantis was never just one city? What if it was never a single island, never a single empire? What if Atlantis is a name, a symbol, for the collective memory of all the lands humanity has lost? Plato may have simply been the first to write it down in Greek, but the story echoes across cultures. Flood myths from Mesopotamia, legends of drowned kingdoms in Celtic lore, the tales of Mu and Lemuria in the Pacific, even indigenous stories from the Americas. Speaking of great floods and vanished homelands, could it be that at the end of the Ice Age, when seas swallowed coastlines around the world, humanity carried with it the memory of catastrophe? And over time, those countless memories condensed into one legend, one name, Atlantis. If so, then Atlantis is not a riddle of geography, but a riddle of memory. Not a single lost city, but a ghost of the Ice Age itself, a ghost that refuses to be forgotten. So, after all this evidence, what can we really say about Atlantis? Our first suspect, the Minoans, a thriving naval empire, destroyed in a single cataclysm, a story so close to Plato's description, it may well have been his inspiration. Our second suspect, the Eye of the Sahara, a geological wonder whose concentric rings mirror Plato's tale with eerie precision. Perhaps a coincidence, or perhaps not. And our third suspect, the ghost of the Ice Age, the drowned lands of Doggerland, Sundaland, Beringia, the collective memory of humanity's greatest loss etched into myth and carried through time. Three suspects, three truths, each powerful in its own way. And maybe this is where we went wrong. Maybe Atlantis was never meant to be found in stone or sand. Maybe Atlantis was meant to be found in the lesson it carries. Because Plato was not a historian, he was a philosopher, and the story he gave us was not a map but a warning. A warning about hubris, corruption, and the fall of civilizations that turn against the natural order. And 2,400 years later, that warning has never felt more urgent. So, does Atlantis exist? Perhaps the answer is yes, not as a city, but as a memory, a myth, a mirror. Atlantis exists as a story that refuses to die, because it speaks to something timeless in us. The real question is not, was Atlantis real? The real question is, are we listening? So tell me, what do you believe? Was Atlantis a real place or a story we tell ourselves? Share your theory in the comments below. Because in the end, Atlantis may not give us answers, but it gives us better questions.